Hello. Today we will be looking at the relationship between Europe and the Americas in the period 1700 to 1800 CE. Before we get deep into particularly the experiences in North America, we want to talk about the fact that this period, the 18th century, this really is the first age of global war. Oftentimes, when we talk about global war, we really think of that as more of a 20th century phenomenon beginning with World War One. But this idea that warfare can spread across the entire world and be fought simultaneously on multiple continents, that really does begin in the 18th century. So wars became globalized for a lot of reasons. Obviously, colonialism is a big part of it, but it's also driven by religious conflict. That's still very much an issue in Europe, Protestants versus Catholics. There are dynastic rivalries, so royal houses in Europe that are in opposition or conflict or competing with one another. And generally, we're talking about just the desire of all of the various European countries to dominate one another. The wars generally start in Europe, but then spread to places like the Americas, the West Indies, Africa, India, even a little bit into East Asia. The movement towards global war also reinforces having strong central governments, and ultimately also generally the weakening of nobilities. And a big part of the reason why the nobility kind of starts in decline is because nobles used to field their own armies, so if we're looking in the late medieval period, the king of France has kind of a small army, but he's reliant upon the various dukes or whatever nobles to provide him with military forces. But now that in the advancement of wartime technologies, nobles just can't afford to have their own private armies anymore because of the amount of equipment that goes along with that. Warfare is starting to become mechanized. The latter half of the 18th century, we're also looking at the very earliest parts of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Britain. So now we're talking about cannon instead of, bows and arrows. And again, I think this was discussed in a previous lecture, but once you have firearms, you really don't have like metal armor anymore because a musket ball will go right through plate armor. So it's really not until the 20th century again that we see soldiers starting to wear some form of body armor. Additionally, we also have kind of an arms race with navies. So we're starting to see huge warships that have multiple tiers of guns on them, and in order to really be able to field a navy that is that large and has that, very large ships, is you have to have an empire to be able to have the resources to be able to afford naval vessels. These were really kind of the stealth bombers of their day, not because they're secret, but because they're very, very, very expensive. So when we look at the balance of power in Europe in the 18th century, we're really talking about Britain versus France. Those are the two most dominant military powers in Europe. France is much more powerful on land. They have a very large army, whereas Britain really kind of controls the high seas. Britain is also much wealthier than France, and that's largely due to commerce, but also sort of the how far spread their empire is. And they also had a really, on a domestic level, they had a strong foundation for an imperial state because there's a partnership between the government, so parliament, along with the aristocracy, along with the banking community. We're going to see why that's so incredibly important during this period. As we said, the dominant dynamic in Europe during this century is that the dynamic between France and Britain. There are other nations in Europe, of course, and they are important, but in terms of looking at global warfare, these are really the only two major global powers. Spain is very much in decline and very much under the influence of France. Austria and whatever remains of the Holy Roman Empire, they don't have navies, to speak of, anything that would go beyond, the Mediterranean region. So it's really just France and Britain we're looking. So we'll start looking at France. And this is, the French Revolution begins in 1789. So when we're talking about France in the 18th century in this lecture, we're talking about pre-revolutionary France. Louis XIV dies in 1715, and just as what happened with Louis XIV, he leaves his 5-year-old son behind to become the next king, and that would be Louis XV. So that back in that place where we have a child king, and so there needs to be a regent, and Louis XV's uncle becomes the regent. Now, we know from a previous lecture that Louis XIV very much centralized the state of France and took a lot of power away from the aristocracy. He had those intendants, and those intendants would rule the provinces for Louis XIV. Well, Louis XV is a very weak king, and the aristocracy is able to pull back much of the power that they lost under Louis XIV. Louis XV reigned for a very long period of time, and much of that time, the leadership was very weak. And so that puts France at a disadvantage because leadership matters, and in an absolute monarchy, leadership matters even more. The French Empire contracts during this period, as you will see. Now, Britain is in a much better space during this period. We have, as was mentioned in a previous lecture, the House of Lords, which kind of works the way that the United States Senate works, except that it is unelected, and only 200 families hold the titles that would allow them to be a part of the House of Lords. Now, another thing that makes Britain different from the rest of the continent, or from the European continent, is that the lords, the nobility, accepted being taxed. All across Europe, lords, the aristocracy, they do not have to pay taxes. So very much like in the modern day, where our wealthiest people pay the lowest amount of taxes. So the lords accepted that they would be taxed. However, because the House of Lords has veto power, effectively, I don't think they use the word veto, but they can limit legislation coming out of the House of Commons, that they were okay with the concept of taxation because they got to control the taxation. So they created a situation whereby they couldn't really be overtaxed because they could they could limit any taxes that were designed to be harder on wealthy people. So, we're talking about 400 families that control a quarter of all of the farmland in England. And so, these large estates, they can't be divided. So they have what's called male primogeniture, which means that the eldest son inherits everything when the Lord dies. And so this is part of the reason why we have so many of the younger sons of the aristocracy moving to North America and setting up their own plantations in places like Virginia. Uh, Small farmers were crushed as a result of this. They could not compete in the same way that small farmers in America today can't compete with large agribusinesses. And so what happens as a result of that is these small farmers, they move to the cities, and they eventually will become the basis of the workforce that will fuel the Industrial Revolution going into the 19th century. In Britain, wealth was the main basis of the elite. It wasn't necessarily the nobility. In France, it's only the nobility, and there are thousands of noble titles, but they don't really have any industrialists. Whereas Britain does, especially in the latter half of the 18th century, you are seeing the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And so you have business people for the really the first time. And they are members of the upper class as well as the small number of noble families. So we're talking about mining, banking, real estate, anybody involved in colonization, and making a lot of money off of that. Those folks would also be considered to be part of the elite. Now we're making a differentiation between aristocracy, which is you have a noble title, you're the Duke of whatever, versus just a broader sense of the elite, which is closer to the way that we think of, the 1%, so to speak, in American society in the modern era. The landholders were encouraged to grow agricultural products that could then be exported to the colonies or used by the military. So there was this concerted effort to produce as much food as possible. We also see, Britain is engaging in the concept of public debt earlier than any other European countries. And as a reminder, the way that works is um, I'm the government, I make you a deal, and I say, you give me $20 today, and then 10 years from now, I'll give you $22. Now, if you're only working in $20, then that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Why would you give the government $20 to get $22 10 years from now? But if you're a wealthy person, and you're not buying just one, they're called bonds. Sometimes in America we call them savings bonds today. If you're buying one bond for $20, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you're buying 10,000 bonds, well, that's a pretty safe long-term investment for you, because you're going to get that interest back at the end of the cycle. So we start to see big countries and empires using public debt to raise money. You raise that money, and then you can spend that money that you haven't actually collected in taxes on, your colonization efforts and your building of your military forces. So we see Britain's public debt goes way, way up during this sort of 30-year period or so. Um, and that has to do with the fact that this is the period when Britain is dramatically expanding their military and their colonization efforts. One very important political leader in this period is Sir Robert Walpole, and he was the prime minister under the first two kings of the House of Hanover, and that would be King George the First and King George the Second. And so that's like the early 18th century. He is, in fact, the first political leader of Britain to use the term prime minister. So that's a term that we just all parliamentary democracies have a prime minister. Walpole was the first person to use that term. He was a gifted politician. He managed to get all of the various factions of Parliament, as well as the king himself, to support his policies. He used something called patronage. Patronage is, I give jobs out to people in exchange for their loyalty, or perhaps because they have been loyal to me in the past. That is sort of the heart of corruption. But corruption's pretty much a dirty word now for most people. When a politician is accused of being corrupt, they're not like, "Yes, sirree, I am totally corrupt, and you should vote for me because of that." We see that corruption is a bad thing. Walpole actually saw it as a good thing. He said that you need to have things like patronage to be able to keep a government stable. Um, that's a debatable point. I would say a point in Walpole's favor is that during this period of time, Britain did indeed have a pretty stable government. But whether or not it's virtuous to, you know, give political jobs to your friends, I think we might disagree with Walpole on that point. So we're going to look now at the spread of global war. The War of Austrian Succession is another one of those pretty forgettable wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. In all honesty, as a guy who has studied world history, European history, all of that kind of stuff, I'd never heard of the War of Austrian Succession until I started teaching this course. Nevertheless, it's part of the curriculum, and so this was an 8-year long war. It starts out with as being a war between Prussia and Austria, and they basically, the Prussians, who were a much more militaristic society, they wanted a chunk of the Austrian Empire, which of course were still within the boundary of the Holy Roman Empire, but the Holy Roman Empire at this point probably only exists on paper, and it's not until Napoleon abolishes it completely. But at this point, it's not like a functioning political entity. So France supports Prussia, and the main reason why France supported Prussia in this war is because the House of Bourbon, which is the ruling family in France, absolutely detests the House of Habsburg, which is the ruling house in Austria and had previously at one time been the ruling house in Spain as well. And it's mainly that issue over ruling Spain that is the reason why the Bourbons and the Habsburgs hate each other. Because Britain and France are like the number one foes on the global stage. Britain sides with Austria because Austria is against Prussia and France is with Prussia, so they'll be on the other side. This war spreads from this area called Silesia, which you can see there is in yellow on the map. It spreads first to Flanders, which is what we call Belgium nowadays, even went to Panama in Central America, as well as in Canada. And by the end of this 8-year long war, totally meaningless war, really, the only thing that changed is the region that Prussia wanted, Silesia, that started the war, Prussia keeps. And that's it. Like, so all of this was to get basically to where they were in 1740. A lot of wars are utterly meaningless and bloody and tragic. Now, the Seven Years' War, that really is, if we're being honest, the first global war. And you can see on the map there that all of the regions that are covered over in pink are places where war was fought. And as you can see, that the war was fought on every continent except Australia and Antarctica. That makes it a global war. So, but it starts in Europe, of course. Now we have different names for this war. In Europe, it's always referred to as the Seven Years' War, but in our sort of cloistered way of thinking about the world as Americans, we call it the French and Indian War because the American colonists saw the French with Native American groups as that was their enemy, that the French and the Indians worked together against the British colonists. So North America is the most important theater of battle with the greatest number of consequences. And at the end of this war, uh, the French no longer have control over any land in North America itself. They keep control of a couple of islands, including half of Hispaniola, which is the half that is soon to be known as the independent country of Haiti. The Seven Years' War also really begins to illustrate the differences between the American colonists and their British overlords. And so we really do see the seeds of the American Revolution in this war. The war did end up effectively ending this rivalry that had lasted for hundreds of years between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. And a big part of that is that it's only a couple days away from the end of the House of Bourbon. So, digging a little bit deeper into the Seven Years' War, in the war in Europe, the sides from that Austrian Succession War, they switch. And so now Britain is siding with Prussia and France is siding with Austria, which is confusing because the houses of Bourbon and Habsburg, they hate each other. So why on earth would France and Austria be actually teaming up? Well, again, it's that mutual threat, right? So Austria says to France, fine, we will give up control of Flanders. That's Belgium. It's right on the border with France. In exchange for the French providing military forces to help Austria fight off Prussia. Generally speaking, if there is a new kid on the block, so to speak, that the people who have something to lose from the change in the status quo, they're going to team up even if they have no other reason whatsoever to team up. If you and I don't like each other, but suddenly there's a greater threat that shows up, then we're going to probably team up to deal with that greater threat. Austria also allies itself with Russia, and this is really the first time that Russia is going to start to be considered one of the so-called great powers of Europe. Um, During this time, we're also looking at this incredible leader of Prussia, Frederick the Great, and he's discussed in a lot more detail in another video. But basically, he was fighting France, Austria, and Russia at the same time, and he won. So he's kind of the goat of the 18th century in terms of political leaders. Like that's a tough thing to pull off. That's like Winston Churchill in World War II fighting off the entirety of Europe under Nazi Germany and winning. So, but you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so eventually, once France sees that Prussia is less of a threat to itself, then it just walks away from Austria, and eventually Russia does as well. But you know, France's goal of gaining control of Flanders, that didn't work out at all because Britain had control of Flanders, and as we're starting to see, Britain is a more powerful or excuse me, more powerful country than France by the end of the Seven Years' War. So, as we have previously discussed, the most important theater of the war was North America. And at the beginning of the war, France had quite a few successes. They invaded the Ohio Valley, which is not just the modern state of Ohio, but also portions of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky. And they invaded to be able to block the British from expanding into the interior of North America. During this period of time, the British colonies stopped at the Appalachian Mountain Range. Uh, they did repel a force that was led by a young British colonel named George Washington, who I believe you have probably heard of. And they also allied with the Iroquois nation in what is now upstate New York. And it was the Iroquois that also invaded the colonial era. Now, in the middle of the war, a man named William Pitt becomes the British Prime Minister, and he's a great wartime leader, but he didn't suffer fools, as they say. And George II hated him because he wasn't deferential enough to the king, I guess. But his grand strategy for the war is to keep Frederick the Great, right, the leader of Prussia, to keep him in the field against France, and that way France doesn't have enough troops to be able to send a large military force to North America. And then, on top of helping to fund and support Frederick the Great, the British also used their overwhelmingly strong navy to bottle up the French and make sure that they can't send troops across the Atlantic. Later in the war, the British army goes on the offensive and they push the French out of the Ohio Valley and all the way back up to Quebec. And in 1760, the city of Montreal, which is still one of the largest cities in Canada, but it was the capital of French Canada, in 1760, it surrenders. And that is the de facto end of the Seven Years' War in North America, or again, as we refer to it in American history, the French and Indian War. Uh, One factor also that led to the ultimate success of the British is that by 1750 or so, there were 2.5 million British colonists in the Americas, whereas the French population never got above 70,000. So if you have 70,000 people total, and I have 2.5 million people total, I'm probably going to win the conflict unless you have dramatically more sophisticated technology, such as what Pizarro had against the Incas when the Spanish first arrived in South America. So at the end of the war, of course, we have winners and losers, and the Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally ended that war. And your primary winner was Britain, right? Britain ends up with all of Canada, They take almost all French territories in India away from France. They get a small but very strategically important island in the Mediterranean called Minorca. It's one of the Balearic Islands. It's part of Spain now. That had been temporarily taken by the French, and they got it back. And then they also get West Florida. West Florida is, for the most part, the modern state of Florida, like the modern boundaries of the state of Florida. They get that from Spain. Spain, they also win. They get the entirety of the Louisiana Territory from France. That wasn't land that America wanted yet, but we will see in 1803 in another lecture how it is that America comes to take possession of the Louisiana Territory. And then they also get a couple of their other colonies back from the French, Manila in the Philippines and Havana in Cuba. Prussia, really the only thing Prussia gets out of it is that they keep that area of Europe called Silesia, which was kind of the whole point of the last war in Europe, which was Prussia wants Silesia. Austria doesn't want to give it up. Uh, Losers. So France is a big loser in the Seven Years' War. They lose pretty much all of their North American possessions. They pick up a couple of additional islands in the West Indies, and they're continued to allow to fish off of the coast of Newfoundland, which is one of the there's this incredible fishery there that we still fish out of a lot, and so they keep the right to fish off of Newfoundland, and the British allow them to continue to engage in trade in India, but they no longer control very much territory in India. Austria gets nothing. They got nothing. They were the ultimate loser of this war, even though they were not even, majorly involved, at least outside of Central Europe. And in addition to they get nothing, they also lose Flanders once and for all. So North America after the war becomes a very different place. Again, the French are off the map, other than in the West Indies, but the British start to become a problem with respect to their relationship with their colonists. So one of the things that they do is they tell the British colonists in something called the Proclamation of 1763, which you will learn about in American history in great detail. But this proclamation tells the colonials, you don't get to cross the mountains. You don't get to start to settle the Ohio Valley. You can't antagonize the Native American peoples. Part of this is that the British didn't want the colonies to get too powerful. They understood kind of the dynamics that are happening now. They stationed 10,000 troops. The British stationed 10,000 troops in the western part of the colonies to defend those borders, not from incursions from natives, but to keep the colonists from entering territory that they have arranged, the treaty with the Iroquois Nation and the other Native American federations, that they wouldn't impinge upon that native territory to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. The bummer for the colonists is that they had to pay the bill for those troops. So the colonists don't want those troops because they want to be able to expand onto the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. But not only are they going to have these troops here to limit them from doing it, they also have to pay for the troops. The colonists are pretty unhappy about that. Prior to the Seven Years' War, the colonists, the British colonists, they were perfectly happy to continue to be British colonists. They all saw themselves as subjects of the British crown. But this effort to effectively alienate the colonies from the mother country is, from a historical perspective, epically stupid. And it was also very difficult to defend the policies that are coming out of the parliament because, of course, the colonies are 3,000 miles away from parliament. So before 1763, the British colonies, they had a lot of independence. They weren't taxed by the British Parliament. They had their own taxation systems in their own colonies. They had assemblies. They had legal systems. They had a very strong economy. They were involved in shipping and fishing, and the part that's not legal is the West Indian smuggling. They didn't they really saw themselves as British people, just British people who lived on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And we will see how the British really start the process of alienating the colonists. From the dawn of the English colonies in North America until the 1760s, the British government let the colonies self-govern and run their own economies and function like little semi-independent entities. That all changes after the Seven Years' War, and now the British start to look at the colonies more like possessions, right? More truly like colonies, the way that they colonize other parts of the world, and that the colonists are subjects rather than citizens. Remember, the British colonists, who would later become the Americans, they saw themselves as British. But once the British start using these really heavy-handed tactics against the colonists, that's when they start to think about wanting to do their own thing. So they put a series of taxes in place that were incredibly unpopular to help pay for those troops that are meant to guard the internal borders, not from invasion, but to keep the colonists in line. And so they have this Stamp Act to fund the British troops. And the way that worked is that any official document had to have a stamp, literally a stamp on it that said that this is an official document, and you had to pay for that. So if you had any kind of a legal document, even newspapers were supposed to have these stamps, and so that put a lot of additional money that went into things that people use every day. So the colonists were deeply unhappy about that, and they did what has always been a very successful practice: is they started boycotting British goods. The one of the biggest markets for British goods in the 1760s and 1770s are the North American colonies. So that represented a huge economic hit to the British government. And then the British Parliament was denounced in many of the colonial assemblies because of the lack of popularity and the lack of the ability to truly enforce the collection of the stamp tax. That tax was repealed by the British Parliament. But again, Parliament is being much more aggressive. So is the new king, King George III. He has a much more aggressive approach towards the colonies. There's this idea that, like, if you just keep treating your subjects worse and worse and worse, that they'll fall in line. And obviously there's a flaw in that logic, because the exact opposite happened. The more harsh the British government became, the more resistance was coming out of the colonies. So when you have sort of, the taxes and import duties are threatened by the colonial economy, that becomes a huge problem. On top of that, you have a new prime minister, Lord North, and he also has a much more aggressive attitude towards the colonies. The colonials, they start protesting, as one does when one is unhappy with one's government in an open society. And in 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. And you may have heard about this before. There's a little drawing of it on the upper image on this slide. Uh, the first person to be killed by British troops at the Boston Massacre was an African American man named Crispus Attucks. So that's just important context, that one of the earliest victims of British violence against the Americans was committed against a black man. Uh, so the Boston Massacre was a huge public relations nightmare, as you can imagine. You even had, some publications in Britain that were coming out against the Parliament. So they lifted all of the taxes that had been put into place on the colonies, except for the tea tax, and that has to do with their relationship with the East India Company. The East India Company was, you'll learn about this in the videos on India, but it was a de facto government of imperial India, at least until the middle of the 19th century. And they were overproducing tea. And so when you overproduce anything, you drive the cost down because you have a high supply and the demand doesn't change. And so then that's going to depress the prices. And so the East India Company needed a place to dump that tea, to dump it in, figuratively speaking, to dump that tea onto the market. Um, so that would have been a huge problem for domestic, local traders. And so there was this group of activists, we'll call them. You could make an argument for calling them terrorists, but I'm going to call them activists, called the Sons of Liberty. And they jumped on board these East India Company ships and they dumped all of that tea that was worth tens of millions of dollars by modern day, in our modern day economy, that would be worth millions and millions of dollars. They dump it all into the Boston Harbor. That was not well received by the British government, to say the least, because it was a huge economic hit. In response to the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. That's what the British called them. The Americans called them the Intolerable Acts. And this was really at the behest of George III, and who wanted to pass laws to punish Massachusetts. And that's exactly what they did. They closed Boston Harbor, which effectively stopped the economy in Massachusetts. They shut down the Massachusetts Assembly, so their legislature, and they imposed martial law. This is really the moment that the other colonies start to realize that this could be a problem for them as well. South Carolina and Massachusetts could not possibly have less in common other than speaking English. But South Carolina looked at this situation and other colonies and said, "Whoa! If they could do this to Massachusetts, then they could do that to my colony as well." As a consequence, these 13 colonies decide to form a deliberative body, and they name it the Continental Congress. And this is just going to give the opportunity for representatives of all of those 13 colonies to discuss the crisis that they were facing with regards to the British. But the British considered just the formation of the Continental Congress to be an act of rebellion. So we're rapidly moving towards war, and the first battle takes place in 1775 in Massachusetts when the British started moving troops towards Boston to occupy it. And a dude who you've probably heard of named Paul Revere goes on his midnight ride, and he rides around uh, the area around Boston, and he doesn't actually say the British are coming. That's we've changed that within our mythology. He says the regulars are coming because that is what they would have said when referring to British troops. So he helps get the Minutemen, who are this sort of irregular group of just local citizens, coming together to defend their colony from those British troops. And so the battles of Lexington and Concord are really the first military conflict in what later is going to become known as the American Revolution. So after the shots are fired, the Continental Congress votes to raise an army. Like, that's it. We know we're going to be fighting now. We're going to need an army. We're going to call it the Continental Army. George III was eager to fight this war, and unfortunately, Lord North was nowhere near as powerful as Sir Robert Walpole, as we saw with King George's father and grandfather, and he's unable to dissuade the king from really wanting to engage in a military conflict with their colonies. Now, one thing that's important to note is that we're still talking about the first age of global war, and while we here in America in our mythology about the Revolutionary War, we just assume that it all took place in what is now America, and that's not true. There were battles of the American War of Independence that were fought in Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, because this was not simply a war between the British Empire and 13 of its rogue colonies. We know that the French have just fought a few different wars against the British and they want payback. And they're willing to do a lot for the British colonies in North America to get their payback. Ultimately, this war is a struggle not just for control of 13 colonies, but for the entire Caribbean Sea and this tussle in the Mediterranean between France and Britain. So in early July of 1776, the Declaration of Independence is issued, and Thomas Jefferson, relied very heavily on the writings of John Locke and the language of the Enlightenment to defend America's basic right to be free and to govern itself. At this point, it's hard to understate just how weak the Americans were. We had very small military force. It wasn't well equipped. It was poorly trained. There weren't that many strong military leaders at the beginning. The Continental Congress gives command of the Continental Army to George Washington because he had some military experience and he was a really tall and handsome guy and carried himself in a very general like way. And they were like, hey, that guy, he looks like a general. Let's put him in charge. Very quickly at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, we lost Boston and New York, and soon after that, Philadelphia. So that's not a great way to open your War of Independence as you lose your three biggest cities. Boston is eventually recovered. New York City is held until after the end of the Revolutionary War and the actual signing of the treaty that ended it. The turning point of the Revolutionary War, though, is the Battle of Saratoga, which is in upstate New York. And it has less to do with the brilliance of the American generals, although the American generals at this point are pretty good, but it was just a absolutely criminal level of negligence by the British general who is in charge of New York. He diverts an army that he intended to march up into upstate New York to help support the British army that was already there. He didn't do that, as a result of which the British army was smaller than the Americans had anticipated, and the Americans were able to trap them and force them to surrender. At that point, at the point at which this rabble, that's just this most disheveled group of people you could ever possibly imagine fighting a war against literally the largest empire on earth, um, they get defeated. The British get defeated. And now Europe is like, oh, hey, look at that. These guys might be for real. And that is what leads France and Spain to jump into this war on the side of the Americans. Again, ultimately, they're less concerned about the freedom of a bunch of English-speaking colonists in North America and much, much more interested in giving the British Empire a big bloody nose. Now, something that we can't imagine in our brains with whatever it is that we remember about the American Revolution, but the largest single battle fought in the American Revolution was not fought in North America. And when we say the largest battle, we mean the largest numbers of soldiers on either side. So there's this huge battle between the British Army and a combined force of French and Spanish to try to retake Gibraltar. If you recall from a previous lecture, Gibraltar is this little teeny point of land at the very southern tip of Spain that overlooks the narrow channel connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. So it's an incredibly important strategic point. Whoever controls Gibraltar is really controlling access to the entire Mediterranean Sea. So it's definitely a piece of land you're going to want to hold on to. And the French and the Spanish put a lot of troops on the ground to fight the British to retake Gibraltar. But because this is happening at the same time as our fight for independence, and it's an extension of that conflict, this is why we say that the largest battle of the American War of Independence was not fought in America. Eventually, the British see their position in the Americas erode. They had some successes in the South. They conquered Georgia and the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. But the British general bumbled into a trap where he got to a city called Yorktown, really town, called Yorktown, and on a peninsula. And so he brings his entire army, 10,000 troops, into this fort, this town on this peninsula in Virginia, and now he's trapped because Washington blocks the exit point of the peninsula at the same time that the French fleet rolls into the Chesapeake Bay. So now there is Lord Cornwallis, who we're going to meet again when we get to India because he's been around for a while. Um, and so now he's trapped with his troops. He can't break through on land because the Continental Army is there, and he can't flee by sea because the French army, or excuse me, the French Navy is in place in the Chesapeake, and he surrenders. He surrenders an army of 10,000 troops. That wasn't the totality of the British troops in the colonies, but it was a significant chunk of it. At this point, the British are struggling economically, and they say to themselves, okay, look, we're still not just the biggest empire on earth, but we're also one of the biggest manufacturers on earth, which means that these former British colonists who are now going to become independent, well, they're still going to buy all of our stuff. And if they're still going to buy all of our stuff, then why are we spending money fighting a war a long way away and spending a lot of money to fight that war? So it just the cost benefit there was no longer in favor of the British actually holding on to the colonies. So after this massive defeat at Yorktown, they begin the negotiations. And at the end of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States is independent. Spain has gotten some territory back. It gets Minorca, which is that island in the Mediterranean Sea. Spain also gets West Florida, which we today know as Florida. And then the French get a country in West Africa called Senegal, and they get a couple more islands in the West Indies. But the main thing that the French got out of the Revolutionary War was being able to give the British a big old bloody nose. However, they spent an enormous amount of their own money helping us get our independence, which was nice. It was very nice, but our Revolutionary War in many ways leads directly to the French Revolution, and a big part of that is France is completely broke by 1783. Um, One other consolation, at least for the British, is that they start settling Australia in 1788. So now they have a new English speaking colony on the other side of the earth that they can kind of focus on now that they lost the Americas. I want to take a moment to talk about a really important historical figure called the Marquis de Lafayette. And I refer to him as sort of like the Where's Waldo of the 18th century because he's involved in almost every major global event from 1776 until the early 1810s. He's everywhere. So he's born in 1757. His father was killed during the Seven Years' War. He was killed in Quebec, so he was an orphan. Well, he's orphaned once his mother dies when he's a small child. And so this is a guy who doesn't really have a family, but he's super wealthy, as most, French nobles were at the time. Um, and like most French nobles, he really was interested in a little bit of payback against the British. And so he eventually sneaks out of France, too complicated to explain, and comes to America and shows up and says, "Hey, General Washington, I want to join your team." Now, Washington would frequently refer to the group of generals, sort of his inner circle, as his family. So another really notable member of his quote unquote family was Alexander Hamilton, who is another orphan. Uh, Lafayette was looking for a family, and he really kind of um, adopted George Washington as his father, not his literal father, but having never had a father figure in his entire life, he looked up to Washington figuratively as well as literally because Washington was 6'4", and that was outrageously tall for the time period. For being a young guy, he was a brilliant general. I mean, he was commanding large numbers of American forces when he was still a teenager. He led the Americans to victory in a number of really important battles, and at a certain point, he actually goes back to France to raise more money for the effort for American independence and also to get some troops and naval forces, which end up being the deciding factor at the Battle of Yorktown. He named his first son George Washington de Lafayette. So that gives you an idea of just how important a figure Washington was to Lafayette. He worked with Jefferson after the war on some trade deals with France. He went, of course, went back to France. At that point, Jefferson was in France as the ambassador for the United States to France. And then, as we will see in a later lecture, Lafayette plays a really vital role in the French Revolution. So now America is independent, or I should say the United States of America. All 13 states were sovereign entities at the end of the Revolutionary War. Sovereign means you are in control, right? So every state was a sovereign entity. And the thing that united them initially was called the Articles of Confederation. It was a very weak form of central government. They didn't have a president. They didn't have the ability to levy taxes, so they couldn't raise any money. So it was really ineffective. And a lot of people were concerned about that because they figured that it could be fairly easy for the British to just re-invade the United States of America and take it over because there was this weak central government and they wouldn't be able to kind of organize. Remember, Britain is still Canada, so they're right there, they're right next to us, and they could invade us theoretically anytime that they wanted to, even though we know that they don't want to. So we hold this really important event in Philadelphia in 1787 called the Constitutional Convention. The thing that came out of that is the United States Constitution, which goes into effect in the year 1789, and that's the first year of our republic. It did a lot of really important things, which you will learn a lot more about in United States history and United States government. One of the important parts is that they firmly separated church and state, and you know, in the early days, we weren't. It's not fair to say that we were a true democracy because only a very small number of people could vote. But for that small group of people who could vote, we really were the most democratic nation on earth and perhaps the most democratic nation since the Roman Republic. And we become a source of inspiration for Europe because at this point, other than the United Kingdom, absolute monarchy is what everything in Europe is. And now the Europeans are looking at us, little teeny tiny America, and we beat the biggest guy on the block. And now these guys are like, oh, hey, look at that. We could have our own revolution and get some of what America has now. That would be awesome. The United States of America was expansionist. As soon as the conflict was over, as soon as the treaty was signed, Americans start pouring over the Appalachian mountain range and into the interior. At the end of when the treaty is signed in 1783, the British give America all of the land up to the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was our western border. But everything that's a part of the United States today, east of the Mississippi, is what we got out of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So we immediately start moving west and we immediately engage in conflicts with the Native Americans, which of course is what the British were trying to keep from happening. Um, just as today, from the very beginning of the Republic, we had massive differences of opinions on things like immigration and developing industry and slavery. So, this idea that at some point we were more united and now we are less united, that's fictional. We have had really, really important, significant divisions amongst the states from the very beginning of the Republic. Now, touching on the Enlightenment had a huge impact on our Declaration of Independence and later our Constitution. So, just looking at it, at three of the figures from the Enlightenment, John Locke was the one that had the biggest impact. I mean, you know, if such a thing could have happened, Locke should have sued Thomas Jefferson for plagiarism, because so much of Locke's writing ends up, not word for word, but conceptually, in our Declaration of Independence, starting with the idea that all religions are equal. Right, our First Amendment says that we have freedom of religion. Jefferson also presents Locke's idea that if you don't like your government and you think it is tyrannical, then you can overthrow it. Um, that's more complicated when we get to the American Civil War, but you'll learn about that in U.S. history. And then Rousseau was the guy that presented the idea that all men are created equal, and that literal 5-word sequence is in our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then Montesquieu was the guy who came up with the concept of the separation of powers, which is critical to the functioning of our government, uh, no more so than today. Not everybody in America wanted to be independent. It was almost a 50-50 split, maybe 60-40 by the end of the war. But that just means that 40% or more of the people who lived in the American colonies were loyalists. They didn't want to be independent. They wanted to remain loyal to the British Crown. Needless to say, the new United States of America was not a great place for people like that to live, and a lot of them moved to Canada. And Canada gets divided into basically an English speaking half and a French speaking half. And today we would refer to those two parts, although Canada is much bigger now, as Ontario and Quebec. So Ontario is sort of the place where English speaking Canada forms, and Quebec is the place where French speaking Canada, it's where French is still the dominant language. And to this day, the legal system of Quebec is actually the French legal system. It's like the Napoleonic Code, whereas Ontario uses the English common law. And to this day, Canada overall has their legal system based off of that English common law, but Quebec still uses that French legal system. Later in 1867, Britain gives Canada self-rule, so Canada never had a war of independence. They asked for independence and they got self-rule. And then by the early 20th century, what happened was called devolution, which is the British Parliament says, you know what, we're going to give you your independence because we're nice guys. And the other colonies that had a population that was mostly white, or at least the white population was dominant and English speaking, they all got this devolution also. So Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa are the countries which you don't have a white majority in South Africa for sure, but the ruling group of people in South Africa during that time were white. Thank you for staying all the way to the end of this presentation.